Welcome to our next lesson on this course, Why Focus on Israel? I believe it is just so vitally important that Christians understand Israel and the Jewish people in the plan of God. If we are going to understand the Word of God, at least in the fullness of what I think God would intend us to understand. See, the Bible, as we've looked at previously, is a Jewish book, written in the Jewish culture, primarily around the Jewish people, the nation of Israel. So we must focus on Israel. What we've been looking at in this course is just an overview on the importance. Certainly much more could be said than what has already been said and what we'll look at in the lessons ahead. But we must focus on Israel. Today we are going to continue from our last lesson, part 2 if you will. On the church, though not unimportant, is a parenthetical focus in the plan of God. And we're going to continue what we started last lesson, picking up in Romans chapter 11 in verse 25. Now, just briefly putting in context, in the first 5 verses of this chapter, the remnant of Israel, Jewish believers in Jesus, are spoken of. In verse 13, Paul the apostle speaks to the Gentiles, magnifying his office as the apostle to the Gentiles. Within that context, 12 through 15, there was this pleading by Paul to bring the gospel to Jewish people, because the effect of that will have just a resounding influence on the church's efforts in bringing people to the Lord. And so we have more of an effort in Jewish missions, Jewish evangelism. We'll find more Gentiles coming to the Lord. That's Romans 11, 12 through 15. In verses 16 through 24, what we are introduced to is the root, which is the Abrahamic covenant. The root of that tree and the branches were broken off. God has put aside temporarily the nation of Israel because of their unbelief. He's grafted into that root a wild olive tree against nature. Gentiles, the church, which is made up of Jew and Gentile, the believing branches of Israel. And he warns the Gentiles especially, don't be high-minded, don't be arrogant, don't be lifted up with pride, because just as God broke off the natural branches, set them aside, so can he do to the wild olive tree and set you aside, the church, if you are lifted up with pride and arrogance. Well, in verse 25, we are told this of Romans 11. For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part is happened to Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. God speaks to believers, to the church. And in the church there are professing believers. He doesn't want us to be ignorant of the mystery. And again, he brings up the thought of arrogance, high-mindedness, conceit, pride. Don't be wise in your own conceits. Blindness in part has happened to Israel. That's mystery. Until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. Now we're going to look at that phrase, the fullness of the Gentiles be come in, which is very important in understanding the context of this whole challenge. Gentile believers are warned not to be ignorant of the mystery because of their conceit, their high-mindedness, their arrogance. The quote that we looked at last lesson from preceptaustin.org says this on this passage of Scripture. Beloved, the church needs to remember that God is not finished with Israel. Anyone who teaches that is conceited and lacks understanding of the mystery in this passage. Replacement theology is such an aberrant, conceited understanding in which the basic premise is propounded that God is finished with Israel because the church is now the Israel of God. How this statement should ring through the churches of the world. Replacement theology is an aberrant, conceited, prideful, arrogant understanding. Exactly what God has warned the Gentiles of. Don't be conceited, wise in your own conceits. The mystery is that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. The entire nation is not blind, only a part of the nation. There is a remnant. There are Jewish people who come to the Lord. But what does the phrase, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in, refer to? What does that speak of? Dr. Charles Feinberg summarizes the various viewpoints as follows. Sanday and Hedla maintain that fullness refers to the Gentile world as a whole. Griffith Thomas refers the time to the close of the Gentile dispensation. Faber, Stifler, Brooks, and Chalmers are all of the opinion that the time referred to is identical with the times of the Gentiles. Godet, after denoting the fullness of the Gentiles as the totality of the Gentile nations, designates the time as the times of the Gentiles. Bosworth contends that reference is made to the large majority of the Gentile population of the world, while Covet thinks the phrase refers to the elect of this dispensation out of all nations. Moll holds that be come in refers to a time when the ingathering of the Gentile children of God will not be at an end, but running high. Obviously, a lot of confusion, a lot of viewpoints on this phrase, the fullness of the Gentiles. So what is the traditional view? Quote, when the two concepts, the times of the Gentiles and the fullness of the Gentiles, are compared, it becomes evident that the times of the Gentiles is primarily a political term and has to do with the political overlordship of Jerusalem. By contrast, the term the fullness of the Gentiles refers to the present age, in which Gentiles predominate in the church and far exceed Israel in present spiritual blessing. It becomes clear, therefore, that while the two concepts may be contemporaneous, at least for much of their fulfillment, the termini of the two periods are somewhat different. The times of the Gentiles will end only when Israel will permanently gain political control of Jerusalem at the second advent of Christ, whereas the fullness of the Gentiles will be completed when God's present task of winning Jew and Gentile to Christ is completed. Close quote. This is a comment from Dr. John Walvoord in an article he wrote for Bibliotheca Sacra, the Dallas Theological Seminary Journal, titled The Times of the Gentiles. It's the traditional view. Times of the Gentiles end with the rapture of the church, when the final Jew or Gentile gets saved, and then we are raptured. Traditional view. Now, there's a growing view. This is mentioned by Sam Nadler in an article, The Fullness of the Gentiles, what it really means. And this view is growing among many in the Messianic Judaism world community. The view held by a growing number of Messianic and other evangelical believers sees the fullness of the Gentiles as referring to the faithfulness of the Gentile believers. In Romans 11:12, how much more there Israel's fullness? The word fullness has to do with the completion of Israel's calling, as opposed to their transgression and failure to do God's will, verses 12 and verses 30 of Romans 11. Thus, the fullness of the Gentiles means Gentile believers will be faithful to fulfill their calling toward Israel to make Israel jealous. Well, that's a growing view. I don't agree with it. I think it's not within the context of this entire chapter 11 of Romans. I also disagree with the traditional view. So here's another possible view. Israel, we know, was preventing the gospel from going to the Gentiles. 1 Thessalonians 2:16. Forbidding us to speak to the Gentiles that they might be saved, to fill up their sin always, for the wrath has come upon them to the uttermost. See, God's plan always was that the gospel would go to Jew and Gentile. It goes back to Genesis 12:3 and that Abrahamic covenant, that root we've been talking about, where all families of the earth shall be blessed. So Jew and Gentile. And the first century Israel, the Jewish people, the unbelievers, were preventing the gospel from going to the Gentiles. We know that. We also know, too, that the blindness upon Israel is national. Israel was set aside in 70 AD. They ceased being a nation. Nationally, they no longer existed. And God started using the church in his plan. Now, the church was brought into existence prior to that, yes. But there were unsaved and saved in the nation of Israel. Third, Israel was set aside so the gospel would go to the Gentiles. This is what God intended all along, as I mentioned. In Romans 11:11, I say then, have they, Israel, the Jewish people, stumbled, rejected their Messiah, that they should fall, that they would be out of the plan of God completely, totally? God forbid. But rather, through their fall, their setting aside, salvation is come on to the Gentiles for to provoke them to jealousy. God allowed Israel to reject her Messiah that Gentiles could be saved. Gentiles are then to turn around and provoke Jewish people to jealousy, that they might come to know their Messiah. Verse 30 of Romans 11 says this, for as ye in times past have not believed God, yet have now obtained mercy through their unbelief. Gentiles in times past didn't believe God, but now you've obtained mercy through their unbelief, Gentiles. Israel was set aside so the gospel would go to the Gentiles. And as a responsibility, the Gentiles were then to turn around and share the gospel with Jewish people. That's verses 12 through 15. The church, point number 4, represented by the predominantly Gentile makeup of the church, were then to provoke to jealousy Jews by sharing the gospel with them. And again, Romans 11:11, salvation has come onto the Gentiles to provoke them, Jewish people, to jealousy. Point number 5. The church did not witness to the Jewish people, though, because of their high-mindedness. The warning was not heeded by the church, the predominantly Gentile church. The warning of Romans 11:18 through 20, not to be arrogant, not to be high-minded, not to be conceited. Unfortunately, it's exactly what the church has been for almost its entire existence. Boast not against the branches, but if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. Don't boast against the Jewish people in Israel. Remember, it's the Abrahamic covenant out of which the Jewish people in Israel came. They are the ones that bear thee. They're the foundation. Thou wilt say, then the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Yes, that's true. Well, verse 20 says, that's true. Because of unbelief they were broken off, and thou stands by faith, but be not high-minded, but fear. And the warning, don't be arrogant, don't boast, don't be proud, don't be high-minded, don't be conceited against Israel and in yourself, but fear what might happen if you do. And tragically, the history of the church has been the exact opposite of the warning here. They had been high-minded, arrogant, conceited, boastful, prideful against Israel. Much of this high-mindedness can be attributed to replacement theology. What has occurred is that, like the Jews who forbade the gospel to go to Gentiles, the church has forbade, at least neglected, the gospel to go to the Jews because of their arrogance, because of their high-mindedness, because of their conceitedness. Consider, for example, the command of Romans 1:16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. To the Jew first, the gospel, and also the Greek. That is priority. And yet, the church has not made it a priority, has at best neglected it, and oftentimes forbade it. Point number 6. The mystery is that blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles become in. The mystery concerns national Israel coming to the Lord when the fullness of the Gentiles, in context representing the church, comes in. 7. The fullness of the Gentiles is when their, again, the predominantly Gentile made up church, when their disobedience has reached its pinnacle in not sharing the gospel with the Jewish people, and God removes them from the earth through the rapture and returns to working through Israel. This fits the entire context of the chapter. And so all Israel shall be saved. As it is written, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. The end of the tribulation period. When the fullness of the Gentiles occurs, after this, Jesus returns, and all Israel is saved. Zechariah 12:10 and chapter 13, 7 through 9 talk about that. They shall look upon me whom they have pierced. They shall call upon the name of the Lord. The fullness of the Gentiles is that the Gentiles reach the peak, the pinnacle of refusing, of not bringing the gospel to the Jewish people. In the same way, that Israel's disobedience, and they're forbidding the gospel to go to the Gentiles. So God set them aside. At the end of this age, the church, predominantly Gentile, because of their conceit, their arrogance, their boastfulness, replacement theology, doesn't bring the gospel to the Jewish people, as Paul argues is a must in verses 12 through 15, if we want to see people saved, the most people saved. And so when it reaches its pinnacle of disobedience to God, the Gentile predominant church, God will cut them off, remove them through the rapture. The termini, the end point of the fullness of the Gentiles, is the same with the traditional view and another possible view, both seeing the termini as the rapture of the church. The big difference, though, is the catalyst, what brings it apart to be. The catalyst for the fullness of the Gentiles is different. The traditional view sees the catalyst as being the last person saved during the church age and then the rapture. That's the traditional view. Whether that last person is Jewish or Gentile, when that person is saved, the last person, then the rapture will take place. Another possible view, which I'm convinced is the correct view in the context of all of chapter 11, sees the catalyst as the church's disobedience in not witnessing to Jewish people, as they have been commanded in Romans 1:16 and Romans 11:11 and Romans 11:30 and 31. God then, as he did with disobedient Israel, removes the church and continues his plan with Israel. Another possible view is consistent with the flow of this chapter. Israel was called to be a blessing to all nations. Not only did they, Israel, not share the gospel with Gentiles, but they forbade it from being shared. Again, 1 Thessalonians 2:16, forbidding us to speak to the Gentiles that they might be saved. That was the Jewish leadership. God, intending all along that all families of the earth, Genesis 12:3, be blessed with a message of the gospel and salvation, temporarily set Israel aside because of her disobedience, and brought the church into existence to go into all the world with the gospel. And I could add, as Paul said in Romans 1, to the Jew first, also to the Gentiles. The church, though, because of pride and arrogance, the erroneous teaching of replacement theology, not only neglected to bring the gospel to the Jewish people, but in many instances forbade the practice. In summary, Romans 11:1 through 11, Israel rejected the gospel as only a remnant believed, and the rest of the nation were blind to the truth. 12 through 15, Israel's being set aside by God was so Gentiles could be saved, and in return, God commanded the Gentiles to take the gospel back to the Jewish people. So ultimately, the entire world would be blessed. That's why Genesis 12:3 and I'll bless them that bless thee, in Romans 1:16 to the Jew first. Romans 11:16 through 24, the church, predominantly Gentiles, is told that the root is holy, the Abrahamic covenant in Israel. And if the church becomes proud and arrogant, not sharing the gospel with the Jewish people, God can and will cut them off, just like he did to Israel in order for him to bless the world. Romans 11:25-32, when the fullness of the church's disobedience to bring the gospel to the Jewish people has reached its pinnacle, God will remove the church in the rapture and go back to working through Israel, with many Jewish people being saved, ultimately all Israel, so the world might receive the fullness of blessing God promised. Ken Symes, in his article, The Fullness of the Gentiles, in Israel's Messenger, the summer of 2018, writes this: So the phrase, the fullness of the Gentiles, is not predicting a number in God's mind of Gentile conversions that when reached will cause him to rapture away the church. Nor does it speak of a Gentile church age. This phrase speaks of the time when the institutional church will have reached the pinnacle of their failure of not sharing the gospel with Jewish people, which will result in God removing the true believing church, that's the rapture, in preparation for his final judgment of the unbelieving world. John Wilkinson, in his book, Israel, My Glory, wrote this: It is a mistake to suppose that the divine order to the Jew first has ever been annulled or reversed. To the Jew first as an individual in this dispensation and as a nation in the millennial era is God's plan. And the neglect of this order has been followed by disastrous results. Indeed, it is probable that the neglect of this divine order, the culpable neglect by the Church of Christ, will be the secondary cause for closing this dispensation in corruption and judgment. The church ought to have observed this order all through this dispensation, but has failed. The Lord himself will see that this arrangement is carried out on his return to bless the world. Wilkinson is saying, to the Jew first has been neglected by the church. It's had disastrous results. And it is probable that the neglect of this responsibility of the church to bring the gospel to the Jewish people will ultimately be the cause for the close of this dispensation, the rapture of the church. When the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, it's not a positive term. It's a negative term. It's when the fullness of their disobedience to God in neglecting their responsibility to provoke to jealousy Jewish people, to bring the gospel first to the Jews, when it has reached its pinnacle and God takes them off the scene and turns back to Israel. He intends to bless the world, and the blessing to the world revolves around Israel and to the Jews, and the church has neglected that, so God will remove the church, that he can bless the world through Israel as he's always intended. Why focus on Israel? Very, very important in understanding God's plan and the Word of God. We'll continue this in our next lesson.